Hello again. Here we go with reading number 50, Rage of the Privileged. Now, the author of this, Ellis Coase, is a columnist and contributing editor for Newsweek magazine. He is the former chairman of the editorial board of the New York Daily News, and he's been a contributor and press critic for Time magazine. He has appeared on The Today Show, Nightline, Dateline, ABC World News, Good Morning America, the PBS Time to Choose election special, Charlie Rose, CNN's Talkback Live, and a variety of other nationally televised and local programs. And he's also the author of several books, including The Envy of the World on Being a Black Man in America, published in 2002, Bone to Pick, of Forgiveness, Reconciliation, Reparation, and Revenge from 2004, The End of Anger, A New Generation's Take on Race and Rage, 2012, Colorblind, Seeing Beyond Race in a Race-Obsessed World, published in 2009, and Democracy If We Can Keep It, published in 2020. And the reading assigned for today is from his book, The Rage of the Privileged Class, Why Do Prosperous Blacks Still Have the Blues, published in 1993, and it's probably his most well-known book. This reading is a bit different in format than what we've had before, and the beginning of it especially is written more similar to a magazine article than the academic articles we've been more used to in this course. The first few pages detail conversations he has had with other Black men and women and their experiences with not being completely accepted into dominant culture in spite of having everything they're supposed to. They are just not completely accepted, and the anger they feel at that fact. And let's be clear here. By dominant culture, he clearly means white culture. So he talks about all these men who are well-educated, well-spoken, who have a higher than average income, who are still sent messages in subtle but consistent ways that they are still not regarded as full members of society. While somebody who is absolutely identical to them in every way except for the color of their skin is. And Mr. Coase not only examines why this occurs, but also why it makes Black men so angry, why it bothers them so much, because those are two different issues. One is why this continues, and the second is why Black Americans who are very successful are still so angered by it. So to directly quote him, these are not isolated incidents, but instead are reminders that whatever they may accomplish in life, race remains their most salient feature as far as much of America is concerned. So he identifies 12 issues or difficulties, 12 obstacles that Black Americans face, although I do want to point out that what he writes about is just as applicable in Canada, even though he's focusing on the US. So the first obstacle he identifies, reading it, brings me right back to the country club reading and the need for the very few people of color at the clubs to be culturally white. Because the first obstacle identified is an inability to fit in. And I appreciate how finely specific Mr. Coase is in explaining this, stating that what it comes down to is an assumption that just because somebody is white, they can fit in, and conversely, just because somebody is Black, they cannot. In other words, being Black or any other visible minority is considered an automatic basis for exclusion. Because of the way you look, you will never truly, completely belong. Well, isn't that at least in part what the civil rights movement was about? Yes. But as I've said in several courses, such as when discussing desegregation of schools in the US, when Brown versus the Board of Education was settled in 1954, making segregation in schools illegal, legal change does not necessarily cause social change. It is not necessarily followed by social change. That is why after Brown versus the Board of Education in 54, across the southern states, students at some schools would encounter protesters outside their schools every single day. Those students still had to deal with an inability to fit in. Another obstacle Mr. Coase identifies is a lack of respect. Very straightforward. The examples he gives of a lawyer or a general in the army. These are identifications that result automatically in a certain level of respect being afforded to that person, usually. And I really can't imagine being in the position of the people he mentions and having that kind of disrespect thrown in front of you so directly. I just can't imagine it. I commented a few lectures ago that I know I benefit from the opposite, an automatic blind respect being afforded to me whenever somebody finds out that I'm a professor. Yet Mr. Coase very clearly indicates that race undermines status. It doesn't matter how clearly respect is due, skin color always takes precedent. Thus, he says that in the United States, it doesn't matter what other characteristics you have, what other label you have, it always comes down to the color of your skin. Now, the next factor identified is a little different because it can be perceived more than one way. When you see the subtitle of low expectations, you probably automatically thought it referred to having low expectations of somebody because of their skin color, which is true, as indicated by the black employee who went to see him. At the same time, Mr. Coase alludes to the fact that because the black employee expected so little of the white employees regarding perception of his race, he was so certain of their inability for change that the employee was also held back by his own low expectations as well. He was so sure he would not be able to move up, his low expectations about the possibility of moving up negatively affected him. Similar to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fourth factor might sound a bit dramatic, shattered hopes. But take a moment to understand the point being made. You do everything you're supposed to. Get the right education, work hard, stay on track, all with the hope of really making it someday. That is your hope. Now, that's going to mean different things to different people. Working your way up in a company and getting a particular position, or earning a certain amount of money, or earning a certain title, whatever it is. But after a while, whether that's in a few years or 20 years, you begin to realize that you're not reaching that goal while others are. And the only difference you can identify between you and them is the color of your skin. And you realize other people of color are dealing with the same thing. If it was one or two, that would be one thing. You could find a reasonable explanation. But it isn't only one or two, it's a noticeable pattern. So that the hope you've always had of true equality, of living in a meritocracy where everybody is judged only on the basis of merit, is gone. It shatters. Faint praise is his next point, and Mr. Coase explains what he means by this by starting with an example of it he encountered by somebody he indicates he actually considered a close friend. And I'm going to help your understanding and mine of what he said by giving it a different term. Faint praise is very, very similar to a backhanded compliment. This is something that comes across as a compliment. It may even be 100% intended as a compliment, but it also contains an insult. So when Mr. Coase's white friend said to him, "It's too bad there aren't more blacks like you," she was complimenting him personally, but insulting black people overall by insinuating that most black Americans are not as hardworking as he is. And he identifies this as something that occurs pretty regularly for black people in America that they have to cope with. Not every once in a while, on a regular basis. It's a compliment for the individual person, but this faint praise is a racist compliment that completely plays into stereotypes. Coping fatigue, which is also referred to as racial battle fatigue. This is exhaustion that people of color feel from repeated exposure to racism. So its negative impact on their emotional and physiological and psychological health and well-being. This affects all people of color. But in the US, Black Americans in particular are forced to deal with a new racism as discussed in previous readings. rooted in what has been called anti-Blackness. So it's not overt racism anymore, it's anti-Blackness. And this means Black people working at predominantly white institutions must navigate this repeated new racism and a particular perception of them as Black people, that their skin color is something they need to overcome in some way. And as indicated in the example of this in the reading regarding Miss Parker, she got to the point where the constant need to prove herself in a way that was simply not expected of white colleagues got to be too much. Not only did she need to prove herself in a manner that her white colleagues did not, but when she did, it didn't result in her gaining any of the rewards her white colleagues had for doing less. And eventually, she just had enough of it, which is sad, but also understandable. Pigeonholing is a phrase that itself means forcing somebody into a predetermined category you already have. And it's usually an unfair idea of what somebody or something is. And Mr. Coase refers to pigeonholing in this context, that even now it's pretty common for there to continue to be certain jobs thought to be best for people who are white and certain jobs thought to be best for people who are Black. And when we say it like that, so overt, plainly, simple, straightforward, of course it sounds ridiculous and of course pretty clearly racist. But he is saying this is something that Black people in the US still deal with all the time. And as evidence of this, he says that you'll find a much higher disproportion of Black people working in public affairs and community relations. Why? Because working in these areas allows them to focus on other people of color. And this comes back as well to coping fatigue. Why is it that for many Black professionals, no matter how much they prove themselves, they're never able to rise to the levels of their white colleagues? Because of the perception of the white establishment that they make better employees at the current level rather than rising further. They are being pigeonholed. When Mr. Coase refers to identity troubles, I could very clearly see an analogy with people who immigrate to a new country and the difficulties they and their children face in trying to adapt to the new country and be as American or as Canadian as they can, while at the same time not losing their cultural heritage from their country of origin. So particularly for the children of immigrants, they want to fit into their new culture as much as they can, but at the same time, the new culture will always view them as different, so they can never totally fit in. And in addition, their parents often accuse them of becoming too Americanized and not maintaining their native culture. So Mr. Coase provides the example of a very successful Black man who came to the conclusion that he could no longer afford to be Black, meaning that he found it necessary to distance himself from any and all racial issues or concerns in order to reach a certain level of success at work, which many immigrant children feel pressure to do. In other words, he needed to be culturally white and passive regarding racial issues. This worked for him and allowed him to achieve the work success that he desired, but at the same time he faced repercussions from other Black employees who said that he had been a sellout. They felt that he downplayed his race in order to make the white bosses happy, and they called him an Uncle Tom. So the phrase Uncle Tom is the title character in a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. And in the book, he practices non-resistance to protect other slaves who have escaped slavery, which is admirable. But he's also unusually compassionate and kind regarding the white slaveholders. And because of this, calling somebody an Uncle Tom is a very derogatory term, implying that they have betrayed their race by being very passive and subservient to white people, even though they know that their own lower status and that of others is based on their race. And for some immigrant children, their parents feel the same way, that assimilating in any way is them turning their back on the culture of the country of origin. Another obstacle is self-censorship and silence. And this point is exactly what it says, that often people of color find they are expected to be completely silent regarding any kind of racial issue, discrimination, racism, prejudice, whatever it is. They're expected by the white establishment to just put up and shut up. Be silent about all of it and you'll experience more acceptance from us. This also might include being careful about what you say and how you say it. So you've got to censor yourself. You got to be careful about what you say. Don't be disagreeable. And that indicates because that indicates you're not being passive and you're not fulfilling that Uncle Tom rule I just mentioned. Another obstacle is mendacity, and this just means perpetuating something that you know is not true. And Mr. Coase gives a great example of this. Mr. Edward Brooke, who was the Senator of Massachusetts in the early 70s. So reading through this example to simplify it, like I said, mendacity means telling yourself something and telling others something that you know it's not true, but you willingly participate in this charade. And Mr. Brooke was elected twice as a senator, and as indicated, even though he knew there was absolutely no way Richard Nixon would ever choose him as his vice presidential running mate in the 1972 presidential election, he went along with this fake optimism tossed around by the press that he could potentially be the first Black man to run for a White House position. And he hated it because he knew it was all completely fake. This reminds me of all the conversations and interviews and everything that was constantly put forth regarding Barack Obama when he was first running for president. Was America ready for its first Black president? Okay, was America ready? Was America ready? First of all, what the heck does that mean, ready? And even though President Obama served 2 terms, and this happened a few years ago, I'm still not sure what being ready for a Black president means. So mendacity refers to something that is commonly told and often told, even though everybody knows it's not true. And this is something Mr. Coase states occurs regularly regarding race. He says this is something people of color have to deal with all the time. This hypothetical, theoretical optimism that is completely false. And by the way, there was also a lot of speculation on Mr. Brooks' possible candidacy for the vice presidency as Gerald Ford's running mate in 76, but that never came to fruition either. Now, the 11th obstacle that Mr. Coase identifies, this is an interesting point. And when I first saw this, I couldn't for the life of me guess what it was in reference to. But now I understand what Mr. Coase is saying. He's saying that there is an expectation that all Black Americans should feel responsible and feel guilty about what other Black Americans do, and that they can somehow explain it. So to give you an analogy not involving race, I've pointed out the ridiculousness of this in terms of religion in other courses. Now, it existed before, but especially since 9/11, Muslims in the US and elsewhere have had to deal with a lot of people believing that since they are Muslim, they must have ties to terrorism. So why is that? In the past, when somebody would talk about an attack on an abortion clinic in the US killing people, or they would talk about an abortion doctor who worked at a clinic who was murdered because of his job, nobody looked at them as a representative of all Christians and then automatically linked all Christians with terrorism because a very small minority of them were terrorists. So why is the situation different for Muslims? Why is it that many people feel that a small minority of Muslims are representative of all Muslims? And why don't we look at the kind of stereotypical white trash white people where generations of their family live on public assistance with no intention of ever getting off of it, yet they continue having kids? Why don't we either generalize them as being the same as the upper class white people or hold higher status white people responsible for them? It's a total double standard, and this is exactly what Mr. Coase is saying when he states that it's common for law-abiding Black Americans to be associated with those or not, and to be expected to explain that simply because they are also Black. Now, the last point Mr. Coase identifies is exclusion from the club. And this point is 100% our country club reading, where it was explained that on average, less than 1% of exclusive country clubs have any people of color as members. But this is still perceived by them to be evidence of racial diversity. Their token diversity discourse serves to perpetuate the exclusion of people of color. So they can have the right education, the right job at the right place with the right income. They can look the part in terms of clothing and cars. They can speak in the proper manner, have 2.4 kids, a well-trained purebred dog, etc., etc., and it still won't matter. As Mr. Coase says, some doors just will not open. And I don't think there's any need to go into more detail regarding this point since we had an entire reading based on the exclusive country club system. So these are the main points that Mr. Coase makes. These are what he identifies as the main obstacles that Black Americans encounter on a regular basis. And I want to be clear that he is clear. These are normal occurrences. These are not exceptional obstacles. They are the norm. They occur frequently all over the country. But his other main point, apart from these obstacles, is that simply put, white people don't get it. And yes, I realize I'm a white person saying that, which is kind of odd. Mr. Coase is saying that the majority of white people just do not see what is occurring. And if they do see it, they don't understand what is occurring. And if they do understand at least some of it, they don't understand the extent of it, nor the extent of that effect. So he's saying that the majority of white society is completely oblivious. They are completely blind to what the situation is for Black Americans every day, and that they buy into this false idea that society is colorblind. So they would look at Black Americans and think, what is it that they're complaining about? They either say, what are they complaining about? Or they're being so picky, they're splitting hairs, they just want everything perfect. Or they're just playing the race card again. Or why can't they just get over it and get with the program? Meaning, why can't they just assimilate into white society? Or Black people are taking this way too far. I don't get that job because I'm white and the company needs to be more diverse, and they're complaining. Or affirmative action is BS. It's just reverse discrimination and they're still complaining. So overall, people who are not people of color still don't get it. Now, we could argue that it's not possible for them to completely understand because they're not people of color. I get that, and I personally think that it's true. There are certain things a person just cannot understand 100% without experiencing them personally. But that doesn't mean you can't increase your awareness in some way, increase your understanding in some way, and try to be more mindful of what occurs as just a matter of course for people of color.